September 28, 2023. Armed officers surrounded a luxury estate in Constantia, one of Cape Town's wealthiest neighborhoods. They arrested a 36-year-old woman named Nicole Johnson on charges that seemed almost mundane: theft of a motor vehicle, assault, robbery. Within hours, investigators discovered an illegal shotgun hidden in a safe inside the home. What they didn't find that day, but what years of investigation had already uncovered, was far more significant. Johnson wasn't just connected to organized crime. According to the state, she was the architect of a criminal enterprise that had successfully captured portions of Cape Town's government, turned social housing projects into extortion rackets, and operated luxury businesses while her husband commanded one of South Africa's most feared prison gangs. The question wasn't whether Nicole Johnson had power. It was how a woman with no traditional gang lineage became what investigators would later describe as the central figure in a racketeering case involving over 50 charges. The answer reveals a transformation in South African organized crime, where the most dangerous operators no longer carried guns but contracts. To understand Nicole Johnson, you first need to understand the firm. In the late 1980s, a man named Ralph Stanfield established a criminal cartel rooted in Valhalla Park, a working-class area on the Cape Flats. Colin was a member of the 28s, one of South Africa's most rigid prison gangs, but he transformed the organization from a purely penal structure into something that functioned in civilian life. The product was mandrax, known locally as buttons. The substance had deep roots in South Africa's apartheid-era chemical weapons programs, and Colin Stanfield turned it into an industry that would fund an empire. The 28s gang had originated in South Africa's prison system as part of what became known as the numbers gangs. These organizations, which included the 26s and 27s, developed rigid hierarchies and codes of conduct within prisons during the apartheid era. Each gang had specific roles and initiation requirements. The 28s were traditionally associated with control of prison resources and certain types of organized crime once members returned to civilian life. What made the firm different from typical drug operations was Colin's approach to community relations. He used proceeds from the mandrax trade to fund infrastructure the state had abandoned. He hired football fields to host massive community feasts in areas like Valhalla Park and Bishop Lavis, providing meat and beer to neighborhoods where government services had collapsed. This wasn't charity, it was a strategic shield. By positioning the firm as a provider rather than a predator, Colin built a layer of popular support that made law enforcement intervention nearly impossible for decades. Residents who might otherwise cooperate with police instead protected the cartel, because Colin's organization delivered tangible benefits the democratic government had failed to provide. The firm even harbored political ambitions. In March 1996, the cartel publicly discussed establishing a political party to contest Western Cape elections. Whether this was a genuine attempt at legitimacy or leverage for amnesty remains unclear, but it reflected the tectonic shifts of post-apartheid South Africa, where criminal networks sought to normalize their influence within the new democratic structure. The discussion of political participation sent a message to authorities. The firm saw itself not as a criminal organization operating in the shadows, but as a legitimate stakeholder in the Western Cape's future. Colin Stanfield died of cancer in 2004. His death created a period of fragmentation within the firm as various factions competed for control. Leadership eventually passed to his nephew, Ralph Stanfield, but the transition wasn't immediate or peaceful. Ralph had to consolidate power, reassert control over the 28 structure, and prove he could maintain the territorial dominance his uncle had established. Ralph was different from his uncle in fundamental ways. Where Colin had focused on drugs and community control, Ralph recognized an opportunity in the formal economy. Specifically, he saw that state resources, particularly construction tenders for social housing, could be captured through a combination of community representation and gang enforcement. The transition from apartheid to democracy had created massive demand for housing in previously neglected areas. The new government committed billions of rands to social housing projects across the Western Cape. These projects required contractors, subcontractors, and suppliers. They created opportunities for legitimate businesses, but also for those who could manipulate the tender process. Ralph Stanfield is described in court documents as a thick-set man with a stoic expression who maintained the 28's gang's leadership hierarchies while expanding into construction and retail. He commanded what the state identifies as a criminal group that engaged in murder, attempted murder, witness intimidation, and drug trafficking. His power derived from his ability to command the numbers, specifically the 28s, which provided enforcers and foot soldiers for the syndicate's various enterprises. The state alleges that Stanfield's group opposed and fought against members of the 27's prison gang and various affiliated street gangs, including the Hard Livings, Dixie Boys, Sexy Boys, and Ghetto Kids. These conflicts took place across Kryfontaine, Woodstock, Perot, Belleville, Belhar, and Earsta River. The violence wasn't random gang warfare. It was strategic territorial expansion designed to give the firm control over areas where government construction projects were planned or underway. This is where Nicole Johnson enters the story. Ralph needed someone who could navigate the formal business world, someone who could submit tender applications, manage corporate entities, and maintain relationships with government officials, someone whose name wouldn't immediately trigger alarms the way his did. Nicole Johnson became his wife, but more importantly, she became the commercial architect of the operation. While Ralph managed what could be called the street, Nicole managed the ledger. This separation of roles was strategic and sophisticated. Johnson served as director of Glomix House Brokers, a company that successfully secured millions of rands in housing tenders from the city of Cape Town and the Western Cape government. Her ability to operate within the formal economy while her husband faced ongoing gang-related investigations highlights a calculated division of labor that would prove remarkably effective for over a decade. Johnson also owned and managed 2 Sorbet franchises, high-end beauty salons in Greenpoint and Canal Walk. These weren't just fronts, they were functioning businesses that provided what every criminal enterprise needs, a veneer of respectability. Johnson claimed monthly earnings of 97,000 rand from these operations, income that facilitated the couple's integration into Cape Town's elite social circles. The salons operated in shopping centers frequented by wealthy residents, putting Johnson in daily contact with the legitimate business community. The beauty industry provided another strategic advantage. It required suppliers, inventory management, staff payroll, and client relationships. All of this created a paper trail of legitimate business activity that could explain cash flows and justify the couple's lifestyle. When investigators eventually scrutinized Johnson's finances, they had to sort through layers of legitimate transactions to find the criminal activity buried within. The question investigators struggled with for years was how Johnson's companies consistently won government contracts in areas where the firm controlled territory. The contracts weren't small. Glomix received multi-million rand awards for housing projects that were supposed to provide homes for some of Cape Town's poorest residents. The mechanism remained hidden behind a facade of competitive bidding and proper procedure. It would take a murder to expose how the system actually worked. For over a decade, Glomix House Brokers was awarded multi-million rand contracts for housing projects, particularly in gang-controlled areas like Valhalla Park. These were the same neighborhoods where Colin Stanfield had built his community support in the 1980s and 1990s. The firm's territorial control meant that any construction project in these areas required their approval, whether explicitly stated or not. Contractors working in Valhalla Park, Bishop Lavis, Delft, or Mitchell's Plain operated with the understanding that certain protocols had to be followed. The mechanism remained hidden until an investigation launched after the murder of Wendy Kloppers, a City of Cape Town official. City manager Lungelo Mbandazayo spearheaded the probe following Kloppers' death, and what investigators uncovered was a sophisticated collusion scheme that had operated in plain sight for years. When bidding for a housing project, the city found that 3 different applications, one from Glomix and 2 from seemingly unrelated companies, were all completed by the same person. This discovery came through meticulous comparison of tender documents. Investigators noticed similarities in phrasing, formatting, and presentation that suggested common authorship. They commissioned a handwriting expert to conduct a detailed analysis. The expert confirmed that the writing size, style, linear spacing, and grammar were identical across the applications. The same hand had filled out multiple supposedly competitive bids. All 3 applications were certified by the same police officer at the Bishop Lavis police station, an anomaly that should have triggered questions during the initial tender review. One director's signature was found to be forged, meaning someone had submitted a bid using a company whose leadership didn't even know they were supposedly competing for the contract. The scheme worked because it created the illusion of competition. Procurement regulations require multiple bids to ensure transparency and value for money. By submitting multiple applications that appeared to come from different companies, the syndicate satisfied the procedural requirements while ensuring the outcome. Glomix would win the tender, or if questions arose about Glomix, one of the alternative companies controlled by the same network would receive the award. Either way, the firm controlled the contract. This gave Glomix and its associated entities control over projects while maintaining the appearance of compliance with procurement regulations. Officials reviewing the tenders saw multiple bids, assumed proper competition had occurred, and awarded contracts based on criteria that had been manipulated from the start. The fraud was elegant in its simplicity. It didn't require hacking systems or stealing documents. It just required someone with inside knowledge of the procurement process and the ability to create shell companies that could pass initial scrutiny. The 3 billion rand King Air Industria project, a joint venture between Atterbury Group and Old Mutual Property, revealed how the construction mafia model had evolved beyond simple extortion. This wasn't a government contract, but a massive private development that would transform a section of Cape Town. The project's scale attracted attention from various criminal networks, but the firm's territorial control in surrounding areas gave them leverage. When construction began, local community members allegedly threatened the main contractor. The threats weren't random acts of vandalism or opportunistic crime. They were coordinated actions designed to halt work until the developers agreed to negotiate. The message was clear: you don't build in this area without permission from the community's representatives. In response, the developers appointed an organization called the Cape Flats Liberators as a community liaison. The CFL was directed by Francisca Stanfield, Ralph's sister. The organization was presented as a community development group focused on ensuring local residents benefited from construction projects in their neighborhoods. It was tasked with sourcing workers and struggling businesses from surrounding communities, a mandate that sounded legitimate and even progressive. After all, why shouldn't major developments provide employment and business opportunities to local residents? Sources indicated that the CFL was a front for Ralph Stanfield, used to funnel project funds into the syndicate. Under this arrangement, Glomix was subcontracted for construction work and paid 7.2 million rand. The payment was justified as supporting local business development and community empowerment. On paper, everything looked proper. In practice, the developers were paying protection money with extra steps. Atterbury's CEO later justified the decision by stating it was the only way to operate in areas where police provided no assistance against the construction mafia. This admission was remarkable. A major property development company, working with one of South Africa's largest financial institutions, publicly acknowledged that they had negotiated with criminal syndicates because the state couldn't or wouldn't protect them. The statement revealed the depth of institutional failure. Law enforcement had effectively ceded control of certain territories to criminal organizations. Companies operating in these areas faced a choice: negotiate with the gangs or abandon the projects. Most chose negotiation. This was the evolution Nicole Johnson represented. The firm had moved beyond extortion as a side business. They had become the gatekeepers of development itself, extracting value from both government and private projects through a combination of violence, community representation, and corporate structures. The foundation of the current case against Stanfield and Johnson lies in a 2014 firearms investigation. This case, part of the larger Project Impi saga, focused on how the 28's gang managed to legalize their weaponry through police corruption. The investigation revealed a sophisticated scheme to subvert the Firearms Control Act, South Africa's framework for regulating gun ownership. In June 2014, Stanfield and Johnson were arrested alongside Francisca Stanfield and 3 former South African Police Service officers, Priscilla Mangyani, Billy April, and Mary Cartwright. The inclusion of police officers in the arrests signaled that this wasn't a case of criminals obtaining illegal weapons. It was a case of criminals using corrupt cops to make illegal weapons appear legal. The state alleged that these officers fraudulently created firearm licenses for Stanfield and his associates. The scheme's mechanics revealed careful planning. After failing to secure licenses at the Mitchell's Plain police station, where officers presumably knew Stanfield's background and refused to process his applications, Stanfield turned to the Oliphants-Fontaine police station in Gauteng, over 1,400 kilometers away from Cape Town. Despite having no residence in the area and no legitimate reason to apply for licenses there, he and his family members were granted permits. Investigators suspected that officers accepted bribes to enter the licenses into the official system without performing any of the necessary proficiency checks, background verifications, or residency confirmations. The Firearms Control Act requires applicants to demonstrate competency with the weapon type, prove they have a legitimate reason for ownership, and pass background checks. None of this occurred for Stanfield and his associates. This allowed gang members to possess firearms that appeared legal during routine police stops. Officers conducting vehicle checks or street searches would run the serial numbers, find valid licenses in the system, and have no basis to confiscate the weapons. The syndicate had effectively subverted the entire regulatory framework, turning the state's own systems into tools for legitimizing criminal activity. The case dragged on for years. Stanfield and Johnson made repeated court appearances, their legal team successfully delaying proceedings through various procedural challenges. They maintained their innocence, arguing that they had followed proper channels and been granted licenses by authorized police officers. If the licenses were fraudulent, they claimed, that was the fault of corrupt cops, not them. But the firearms case established something crucial for investigators, a documented pattern of police corruption connected to the couple. It proved the firm had the resources and connections to compromise officers, access official systems, and manipulate state institutions from within. This would become essential when building the larger racketeering case nearly a decade later. The firearms case also revealed the extent of police infiltration. A 2022 High Court judgment warned that 28 gangsters had wormed their way into police management, accessing crime intelligence reports. This wasn't just low-level corruption. Gang members or their associates had obtained positions within SAPs that gave them access to sensitive information about ongoing investigations, witness identities, and operational plans. The power of the Stanfield-Johnson syndicate wasn't maintained through contracts alone. It required strategic violence, specifically targeted assassinations designed to eliminate rivals, silence witnesses, and intimidate state officials. The murders attributed to the firm weren't crimes of passion or opportunistic violence. They were calculated operations executed with military precision. On December 13, 2019, Rashid Staggy, the legendary leader of the Hard Livings gang, was gunned down outside his home in Salt River. Staggy was a figure of immense historical significance in Cape Town's underworld. Along with his twin brother Rashad, he had built the Hard Livings into one of the most feared gangs on the Cape Flats during the 1980s and 1990s. The state claims that members of the firm, including individuals named Jonathan Cloete and Shaquille Pelston, planned and carried out the murder as part of a turf war. The location was symbolically significant. Staggy was killed on the exact spot where his twin brother Rashad had been burned alive by the vigilante group People Against Gangsterism and Drugs in 1996. That murder had shocked South Africa, with images of Rashad Staggy burning to death broadcast on national television. Killing Rashid on the same spot wasn't just about eliminating a rival. It was about sending a message that the firm controlled not just territory, but history and memory itself. The killing demonstrated a level of symbolic sophistication that went beyond typical gang violence. William Stevens, known as Red, was a high-ranking member of the 27s gang. He was gunned down in Kraaifontein in February 2021. The state alleges that firm members planned the killing as revenge for the murder of Brian Weinstein, a global steroid smuggler and associate of the 28s known as the Steroid King. Weinstein had been murdered at his home in 2017, a hit that sent shockwaves through Cape Town's underworld because of his international connections. Stevens had been an accused in the Weinstein murder case alongside other underworld figures like Mark Liffman and Jerome Buisson. By killing Stevens, the firm was settling scores and demonstrating they could reach high-value targets, even when those targets were under police scrutiny due to other cases. These weren't random acts of gang violence. They were calculated moves in a broader strategy to consolidate control over Cape Town's criminal economy. Each assassination eliminated a rival who controlled territory, drug distribution networks, or protection rackets. Each killing sent a message to other gangs about the firm's reach and willingness to use lethal force. But the most significant murder attributed to the syndicate was the killing of Wendy Kloppers, a City of Cape Town official. This represented a fundamental escalation from gang-on-gang violence to direct attacks on state representatives. Wendy Kloppers was shot while sitting in her car at the Symphony Way housing site in Delft on February 16, 2023. She was a municipal employee, not a gang member. Her role involved oversight of construction projects, ensuring contractors met specifications and funds were properly spent. The indictment alleges that members of the firm planned to kill any person at the site to stop work and force the city to award the contract to gang-linked companies. The phrasing is significant. Any person. This wasn't a targeted hit on Kloppers, specifically because of something she had done or discovered. It was a strategic decision to kill whoever represented the city at the construction site as a way to intimidate officials and halt progress until the firm's demands were met. Kloppers happened to be at the site conducting her normal duties when she was killed. The murder could have targeted any city employee present that day. The violence was designed to create an environment where no official felt safe working on projects in gang-controlled areas without the syndicate's approval. This wasn't gang warfare. It was a direct attack on the state's executive function, an attempt to make certain territories ungovernable except with gang permission. The killing triggered a massive response. City manager Lungelo Mbandazayo launched the investigation that would eventually expose the tender collusion scheme and connect it to the firm. The Special Investigating Unit became involved. The National Prosecuting Authority began assembling what would become the comprehensive racketeering case against Stanfield and Johnson. Kloppers' murder represented a line crossed. Gang-on-gang violence, while tragic, was often seen as criminals killing criminals. The murder of a government official conducting her lawful duties was different. It demonstrated that the firm viewed the state not as an authority to be evaded, but as an obstacle to be removed through violence if necessary. The attack on Kloppers signaled that nowhere was safe, that no government employee could assume they were protected by their official status. For investigators and prosecutors, the murder provided additional motivation. Building cases against gang leaders is difficult because witnesses are intimidated and evidence is hard to gather. But when gang members start killing government officials, the state's institutional interest in prosecution intensifies. The period following Kloppers' murder saw a fundamental shift in how authorities approached the firm. Previously, Stanfield and Johnson had faced periodic investigations and arrests, but these had always resulted in delays, withdrawals, or acquittals. The Firearms case had been pending since 2014 with no resolution. The couple continued to operate businesses, win government contracts, and live openly in their Constantia mansion. The murder changed the calculus. City manager Lungelo Mbandazayo's investigation uncovered the tender collusion scheme through forensic analysis of bid documents. The discovery that multiple supposedly independent bids were completed by the same person, certified by the same officer, with forged signatures, provided hard evidence of systematic fraud. This wasn't a matter of interpretation or witness testimony that could be challenged. It was documentary evidence that could be presented in court. In March 2023, police raided the office of Malusi Bui, the former Human Settlements MMC. The raid sought records of Bui's interactions with Stanfield and other gang leaders. Investigators were pursuing a theory that the tender fraud required inside assistance from someone with authority over the procurement process. Bui's position gave him influence over which projects were prioritized, how tenders were structured, and which officials evaluated bids. Sources described a web of connections between city staff and underworld figures. The investigation revealed that the corruption wasn't limited to frontline employees processing applications. It extended into management and political leadership. While commercial charges against Bui were provisionally withdrawn in May 2025 due to new evidence, his downfall highlighted how deeply gang influence had penetrated municipal procurement. The Special Investigating Unit flagged the Stanfield-Johnson operation as part of the construction mafia in December 2023. The SIU is a specialized agency established to investigate corruption involving state institutions. Its involvement brought additional investigative capacity and legal tools to the case. The SIU's findings provided the basis for administrative action, even while criminal prosecutions were being prepared. This was followed by a decisive move from the National Treasury, which blacklisted Glomix house-brokers for 10 years, effective from March 2024 to March 2034. The official reason was the submission of a fraudulent broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Certificate, a relatively technical charge that the state utilized to cut off the syndicate's primary legitimate revenue stream. The BBBE certificate fraud was significant because it struck at the mechanism the firm used to qualify for government contracts. South Africa's BBBE program requires companies bidding on government tenders to demonstrate ownership and management by previously disadvantaged individuals. Companies receive points based on their BBBE level, which affects their competitiveness in the tender process. By submitting fraudulent certificates, Glomix had been claiming BB status it didn't legitimately possess, artificially inflating its scores and winning contracts it shouldn't have qualified for. But investigators wanted more than administrative sanctions. They wanted to dismantle the entire enterprise through criminal prosecution. Throughout 2023, a team of prosecutors pieced together a 35-page indictment that wove together the firearms case, the social housing fraud, and several high-profile murders into a single racketeering charge under the Prevention of Organized Crime Act. The Prevention of Organized Crime Act provides South African prosecutors with tools similar to the United States RICO statute. It allows charges based not just on individual criminal acts, but on participation in an ongoing criminal enterprise. To secure a conviction under POCA, the state must prove the existence of a criminal organization, demonstrate that the accused held leadership or participatory roles within it, and show that various criminal acts were undertaken in furtherance of the enterprise's goals. The advantage of POCA charges is that they allow prosecutors to connect seemingly disparate crimes into a single coherent narrative. The firearms corruption, the tender fraud, and the murders can all be presented as parts of a unified criminal strategy rather than unrelated incidents. The indictment named Ralph Stanfield as the leader of a criminal enterprise known as the Firm and Nicole Johnson as a central figure in over 50 charges, including racketeering, money laundering, and fraud. The charges against Johnson were particularly detailed regarding her role in the economic crimes. The indictment described her as the primary operator of Glomix house brokers and connected entities, the architect of the tender collusion scheme, and the financial manager who moved money between legitimate businesses and criminal operations. The state's theory was that while Ralph commanded the gang's enforcement capacity and territorial control, Nicole controlled the financial mechanisms that made the enterprise sustainable and profitable. She didn't order murders or intimidate witnesses directly. Her role was to ensure the criminal activities generated revenue that could be laundered through legitimate businesses and used to fund the syndicate's operations. The indictment also charged Abraham Wilson, an alleged hitman now deceased, and Jonathan Cloete, described as a senior member of the firm involved in multiple murders. The inclusion of these individuals allowed prosecutors to detail the enforcement arm of the enterprise, showing how violence was used systematically to protect business interests. The challenge in building the case was connecting Johnson's corporate activities to the violence committed by gang members. The state needed to prove that the murders, the intimidation, and the fraud were all part of a unified enterprise, not separate activities conducted by different people for different reasons. The connection ran through money. The revenue from fraudulent tenders funded the firm's operations, paid gang members, and supported the lifestyle that attracted recruits. The violence protected the revenue streams by eliminating rivals and intimidating officials who might interfere with the fraud. For years, Stanfield and Johnson lived in a multi-million rand home in Constantia. This choice of residence was more than personal preference. It was a statement of power and a demonstration of how far the firm had evolved from its Cape Flats origins. Constantia is one of Cape Town's oldest and most expensive suburbs. It's known for wine estates, large properties, and residents who include business executives, politicians, and old money families. For a gang leader and his wife to establish themselves there represented a level of wealth and social acceptance that earlier generations of criminals could never have achieved. The Constantia property served practical purposes as well. It was far from the gang's operational territories, reducing the likelihood of surprise attacks from rivals. The suburb's private security and low crime rates meant police presence was minimal, reducing the risk of surveillance. The neighbors were wealthy professionals unlikely to know or care about gang politics on the Cape Flats. On the morning of September 29, 2023, visible policing members and detectives from the Western Cape Anti-Gang Unit surrounded the Constantia estate. The operation involved significant planning and coordination. Authorities knew from the Firearms case that Stanfield might be armed. They also understood from the murder charges being prepared that members of the firm were capable of extreme violence. The raid was conducted with overwhelming force to prevent resistance. They arrested Ralph, 44, and Nicole, 36. The initial charges seemed disconnected from the larger investigation. Theft of a motor vehicle, assault, and robbery stemming from an incident in Milnerton where the couple allegedly towed away a BMW from a security complex. The choice to arrest them on these charges rather than immediately serving the racketeering indictment was strategic. The motor vehicle charges provided legal justification for the arrest and search while investigators finalized the more complex Possier case. During the search of the home, police discovered the illegal shotgun in a safe, leading to additional charges of illegal possession of a firearm. This echoed the 2014 case and provided another basis for denying bail. The state used these charges to keep the couple in custody while the racketeering investigation continued. Prosecutors argued that Stanfield and Johnson were flight risks given their financial resources, and that they posed a danger to witnesses given the firm's history of intimidation and murder. The bail hearings revealed details about the couple's lifestyle and finances. Johnson's lawyers argued for release based on her legitimate business interests and medical needs. It was revealed that she had undergone surgery just the day before her arrest and was struggling to recover in prison conditions. Following their arrest, both Stanfield and Johnson were held in high-security facilities. Ralph was sent to Brandvlei, a prison about 80 kilometers northeast of Cape Town. Nicole went to Pollsmoor, the sprawling prison complex in Tokai that had historical significance as a site where the 28s and other numbers gangs had developed their structures during the apartheid era. The irony wasn't lost on observers. The alleged leader of the firm was in Brandvlei while his wife sat in the same institution where his gang's codes and hierarchies had been forged decades earlier. The couple's complaints about prison conditions became part of their bail arguments. Ralph described being held with sentenced criminals in dangerous conditions. He claimed he was being denied adequate medical care and contact with his wife. He characterized his detention as being basically already sentenced without a fair trial, arguing that the conditions amounted to punishment before conviction. Nicole's legal team emphasized her medical situation. She had undergone surgery shortly before arrest and required follow-up care that wasn't available in Pollsmoor. They argued that her businesses, the sorbet franchises, were suffering because staff couldn't be paid without her oversight. This framing positioned Johnson as a legitimate businesswoman being punished for her husband's alleged crimes. The state countered that Johnson wasn't a peripheral figure or innocent spouse. The tender fraud investigation identified her as the primary operator of Glomix and the architect of the collusion scheme. Her businesses might be legitimate, but they also served to launder money and provide cover for criminal activities. The prison complaints revealed another aspect of the couple's integration into Cape Town's elite. They were accustomed to a level of comfort and medical care that simply wasn't available in the prison system. For people who had lived in a Constantia mansion and managed high-end businesses, the transition to prison was particularly jarring. While Stanfield and Johnson sat in custody, authorities moved against their business interests. On December 19, 2023, the city of Cape Town blacklisted 7 companies linked to Johnson. The blacklisting prevented these entities from bidding on any municipal contracts for a specified period. The companies included Glomix House Brokers and the Sorbet franchises in Greenpoint and Canal Walk. The city cited reputational risk as justification for the action. Even if criminal charges hadn't resulted in convictions yet, the association with the Stanfield-Johnson investigation was sufficient to exclude the companies from government business. This was a significant escalation. Previously, Johnson's businesses had operated openly despite ongoing investigations into her husband. The city had awarded contracts to Glomix even as Stanfield faced gang-related charges. The blacklisting represented a decision to treat Johnson's corporate entities as extensions of the criminal enterprise rather than separate legitimate businesses. The National Treasury's 10-year blacklisting of Glomix in March 2024 went further. This wasn't a municipal decision that might be reversed by a new city administration. It was a national prohibition that prevented Glomix from doing business with any government entity at any level for a decade. The Treasury based the blacklisting on the fraudulent BBBEE certificate, a technical violation that provided legal grounds for the action. But the effect was to completely sever the syndicate's primary revenue stream from state resources. For 10 years, Glomix couldn't bid on housing projects, infrastructure contracts, or any other government work. The companies would have to be dissolved, or could perhaps operate in the private sector, but their access to the public tenders that had generated millions of rands was permanently cut off. The blacklisting raised questions about why it had taken so long. The tender collusion had operated for over a decade. Multiple housing projects had been awarded to Glomix despite the company's connections to a known gang leader. The handwriting analysis that proved fraud was conducted only after Wendy Kloppers was murdered. Either authorities hadn't looked closely at Glomix's tender submissions before, or they had overlooked irregularities that should have triggered investigation. The delay suggested a systemic failure in procurement oversight. The mechanisms existed to detect fraud, but they hadn't been consistently applied. It took a murder to prompt the level of scrutiny that revealed the scheme. On September 2, 2024, while detained in Pollsmoor Prison awaiting trial, Nicole Johnson purchased a 5 million rand unbonded flat in Sea Point. The transaction was remarkable for several reasons. First, it demonstrated that despite being in custody, Johnson retained access to significant financial resources. 5 million rand in cash, or access to financing that didn't require traditional bank bonds, suggested wealth far exceeding what could be explained by the Sorbet franchise's legitimate earnings. Second, it showed the syndicate's financial infrastructure remained operational. Someone outside prison was managing accounts, moving money, and conducting transactions on Johnson's behalf. This indicated the firm hadn't been dismantled by the arrests. It had adapted, with second-tier managers continuing operations while leadership sat in custody. Third, the transaction exposed vulnerabilities in South Africa's property market regulations. By using developers who make direct sales rather than traditional bond-financed purchases, buyers can avoid much of the scrutiny that typically accompanies large real estate transactions. Banks conducting due diligence for bond approvals might flag a purchase by someone under indictment for racketeering. Direct sales to developers avoid this oversight. The Sea Point purchase debunked assumptions that luxury property markets are insulated from organized crime. High-end real estate has long been recognized internationally as a vehicle for money laundering, but South Africa's regulations hadn't adequately closed the loopholes that allow prison inmates to conduct multi-million rand transactions. The property deal also highlighted questions about asset forfeiture. Under POCA, the state can seek to freeze and ultimately confiscate assets derived from criminal activity or used to facilitate crimes. If Johnson's wealth came from tender fraud and the firm's criminal operations, authorities should theoretically be able to prevent her from using those funds to buy property. The fact that the Sea Point purchase proceeded suggested either that the state hadn't successfully frozen all assets, or that Johnson had structured her finances in ways that made it difficult to prove which funds were criminal proceeds and which came from legitimate businesses. For prosecutors building the racketeering case, the transaction provided additional evidence of money laundering and demonstrated the ongoing nature of the criminal enterprise. For defense attorneys, it could be framed as a legitimate business transaction by someone who hadn't been convicted of any crime and retained the right to manage her financial affairs. On July 14, 2025, the formal indictment was presented in the Western Cape High Court. The 35-page document represented nearly 2 years of investigation and compilation following the Constantia arrests, and over a decade if measured from the 2014 Firearms case. The charges against Ralph Stanfield and Nicole Johnson were comprehensive. Racketeering under the Prevention of Organized Crime Act for leading and managing a criminal enterprise known as the Firm, multiple counts of murder including the assassinations of Rashid Staggy, Wendy Kloppers, William Stevens, and others identified in the indictment, fraud and corruption related to social housing tender collusion, submission of fraudulent BBBEE certificates, and bribery of officials, illegal possession of firearms and ammunition, and money laundering through the property purchases and business operations. The indictment detailed the firm's structure, identifying Ralph Stanfield as the overall leader who commanded the 28 gang members and directed the enterprise's strategic direction. Nicole Johnson was described as the financial and corporate operator who managed legitimate businesses, submitted tender applications, conducted collusion schemes, and laundered money through property and business transactions. Other named co-accused included Francisca Stanfield, Ralph's sister and director of the Cape Flats Liberators, charged with fraud related to the King Air Industria project and facilitating tender manipulation. Jonathan Cloet and Shaquille Pelston, alleged members of the firm charged with planning and executing the Rashid Staggy murder and other gang-related violence. Various former police officers connected to the Firearms corruption case. The state's narrative tied these individuals together through the firm, arguing that each person played a specific role in a coordinated criminal enterprise. The indictment included a detailed chronology of events from the late 1980s establishment of the firm under Colin Stanfield through the present day. It described how the organization evolved from a drug cartel to a diversified criminal enterprise that captured government resources. The murder charges were supported by witness statements, forensic evidence, and electronic communications that allegedly showed planning and coordination. The fraud charges relied heavily on the documentary evidence from the tender collusion investigation, including the handwriting analysis and certification irregularities. In May 2025, just 2 months before the formal indictment was presented, the National Prosecuting Authority provisionally withdrew commercial charges against Stanfield, Johnson, and Malusi Bowie. The stated reason was that police had discovered new evidence. The NPA indicated it planned to reinstate the charges once the investigation was finalized, but provided no details about what the new evidence entailed. This development created significant uncertainty about the case. Several interpretations emerged among legal observers and journalists covering the proceedings. One theory held that the new evidence pointed to additional actors not yet charged, potentially higher-level political figures or business people who had facilitated or benefited from the tender fraud. If this were true, prosecutors might be delaying the commercial charges to build a more comprehensive case that captured the full scope of the conspiracy. Another interpretation suggested the new evidence might complicate the existing case, perhaps contradicting some of the state's allegations or providing alternative explanations for transactions previously attributed to criminal activity. If this were accurate, the withdrawal might represent a setback requiring prosecutors to reassess their strategy. A third possibility was that the evidence related to the extent of police infiltration by the firm, potentially compromising some of the investigative work or revealing that gang associates had accessed files related to the case. This could require prosecutors to verify that evidence hadn't been tainted and that witness identities hadn't been compromised. The provisional withdrawal affected only the commercial charges related to tender fraud and BBBE violations. The murder charges, firearms charges, and overall racketeering allegations remained active. This suggested the new evidence specifically concerned the corporate aspects of the case rather than the violent crimes. For observers, the development highlighted how complex and lengthy these prosecutions can become. What appeared to be a straightforward case of tender fraud became more complicated as investigators dug deeper into the financial relationships and institutional connections surrounding the firm. The delay also benefited the defense by creating additional time for memories to fade, witnesses to reconsider cooperation, and public attention to move elsewhere. What Nicole Johnson helped perfect, and what the Stanfield-Johnson case illuminates, is the construction mafia model, a system that blurs the line between community representation and organized extortion. Understanding this model requires examining how it functions across South Africa's urban areas. The mechanism operates through several stages. First, criminal syndicates establish territorial control over specific areas through historical gang presence, violence against rivals, and community relationships built through social programs or intimidation. This creates a situation where the gang is recognized as the de facto authority in certain neighborhoods with more immediate power than police or government officials. When government agencies or private developers announce construction projects in these areas, the syndicates approach contractors claiming to represent the community's interests. They demand that local residents be hired for jobs, that local businesses receive subcontracts, and that community liaison organizations be engaged to facilitate the project. These demands are framed in the language of economic empowerment and transformation, making them difficult to refuse without appearing to oppose legitimate community development. If developers refuse to negotiate or attempt to proceed without gang approval, construction sites face escalating problems. Initial incidents might include theft of equipment or materials, minor vandalism, or workers being intimidated on their way to the site. If the developer continues to resist, the violence escalates to include direct threats against site managers, destruction of completed work, or attacks on vehicles and personnel. Most developers, particularly those working on government-funded social housing projects with tight budgets and deadlines, choose to comply rather than fight. The cost of private security sufficient to protect a construction site in gang-controlled territory would be prohibitive. The delays caused by ongoing intimidation would blow budgets and timelines. Negotiating with the gang through their community representatives appears to be the practical solution. The syndicate then creates front companies that appear legitimate on paper. These entities are registered with the Companies and Intellectual Property Commission, obtain tax clearances, and submit professionally prepared tender applications. On the surface, they look like legitimate small businesses seeking to benefit from government procurement opportunities. These companies submit bids for tenders, often using collusion techniques like those uncovered in the Glomix investigation. Multiple supposedly independent bids are prepared by the same people, creating the illusion of competition while ensuring the outcome. Once contracts are awarded, the actual work is either not performed poorly by unqualified crews, or subcontracted to legitimate firms who complete it while the front company takes a substantial cut. In the latter case, the legitimate subcontractor does the work, while the gang-linked company extracts value simply for providing access to the site. The beauty of this model from a criminal perspective is that it requires minimal violence once established. The initial territorial control might have been achieved through gang warfare and intimidation, but once the pattern is established, developers know what's expected. The threat becomes implicit. It also provides a veneer of social legitimacy because the syndicates claim they're fighting for local employment and economic empowerment. Politicians and community activists may even support their demands, seeing them as reasonable requests for local residents to benefit from developments in their neighborhoods. In reality, the syndicates are extracting value from projects meant to alleviate poverty in the very communities they claim to represent. Atterbury's CEO's statement that engaging the Cape Flats liberators was the only way to operate where police provided no assistance was a damning admission. It revealed that major corporations and government entities had accepted gang mediation as a cost of doing business. The construction mafia wasn't an aberration or a temporary problem. It had become a permanent feature of Cape Town's development landscape, with institutional actors incorporating gang negotiations into their project planning. The implications extend beyond individual projects. If government housing programs are systematically compromised by gang extortion, the effectiveness of public spending is dramatically reduced. Money meant to provide homes for poor families is instead enriching criminal enterprises. The housing deficit persists not just because of limited funding, but because significant portions of allocated funds are being stolen through this mechanism. Nicole Johnson's case challenges common assumptions about women's roles in organized crime. The stereotype of the gangster's wife portrays women as either victims trapped in abusive relationships with criminals, or as accessories who benefit from illegal proceeds but don't actively participate in crimes. Johnson fits neither category. According to the state's case, she was the director of Glomix House Brokers, the primary manager of tender applications and collusion schemes, the operator of multiple legitimate businesses, and the financial manager conducting multi-million rand transactions. She wasn't on the periphery of the firm's operations. The indictment describes her as a central figure whose corporate activities were essential to the enterprise's success and profitability. This challenges gendered stereotypes about organized crime in several ways. It demonstrates that as criminal enterprises become more economically sophisticated, traditional gender divisions may become less relevant. What matters for tender fraud isn't physical intimidation or street credibility. It's the ability to navigate bureaucratic systems, maintain corporate facades, manage financial flows, and build relationships with officials. These are skills where gender provides no inherent advantage or disadvantage. The case also reveals how gender can be strategically deployed. Johnson's identity as a businesswoman and beauty salon owner provided cover that a male gang member couldn't achieve. Her businesses operated in upscale shopping centers serving wealthy clients. This created a public image far removed from the Cape Flats gang violence that defined her husband's world. There's also a question of visibility and attention. Ralph Stanfield was known to police as a gang leader for years before his arrest. Nicole Johnson operated with less scrutiny, despite building the corporate empire that made the firm's economic crimes possible. Investigators focused on the men committing murders, while the woman managing the money moved more freely. This suggests law enforcement may have its own blind spots based on gendered assumptions about who participates in organized crime and in what capacities. The state's decision to charge Johnson as a central figure rather than a peripheral associate represents an important shift. It acknowledges that modern organized crime isn't just about violence and drugs. It's about corporate capture, tender fraud, and institutional corruption. These crimes require different skills and open opportunities for participants who don't fit traditional gang member profiles. If the prosecution succeeds and Johnson receives a lengthy sentence under POSA, it will establish a precedent for how South African courts treat women who serve as the economic architects of criminal enterprises. The sentence would send a message that financial enablers are as culpable as those who commit violence. If the prosecution fails, it might reinforce assumptions that women in these roles are less blameworthy or harder to convict because they maintain distance from the most violent aspects of gang operations. Despite the arrests, the blacklisting, and the pending trial, multiple indicators suggest the firm continues to operate. The Sea Point property transaction demonstrated the syndicate retained the ability to move millions of rands while its leadership sat in prison. This requires operational infrastructure, people managing accounts, conducting transactions, and maintaining business relationships on behalf of detained leaders. Construction sites in gang-controlled areas reportedly still face the same patterns of intimidation that characterized the Stanfield era. Developers continue to negotiate with community representatives who demand local hiring and subcontracting arrangements. The model Johnson and Stanfield perfected has outlasted their arrests. This raises fundamental questions about whether dismantling a criminal enterprise is even possible once it reaches a certain level of institutional integration. The firm has existed in various forms since the late 1980s when Colin Stanfield established it. The organization survived Colin's death in 2004, the transition to Ralph's leadership, the 2014 Firearms case and subsequent prosecutions, and the 2023 arrests of its current leaders. Each time authorities move against the firm, it adapts. New leaders emerge from the 28's gang structure. Operations become more covert. The enterprise continues in modified form. Criminal organizations with deep community roots, territorial control, and diversified revenue streams don't disappear simply because leaders are imprisoned. The 28's gang structure provides continuity. It's not a corporate hierarchy where removing the CEO paralyzes the organization. It's a prison gang with defined ranks, initiation processes, and succession mechanisms. If Ralph Stanfield is convicted and sentenced, someone else within the 28's will assume leadership. That person might lack Ralph's strategic vision or Nicole's corporate sophistication, but they'll inherit the territorial control, gang membership, and institutional knowledge the firm has accumulated. There's also the question of what happens to the legitimate businesses. The sorbet franchises have been blacklisted by the city, but they remain viable businesses with client bases and trained staff. If Johnson is acquitted or released, she could potentially resume operations. If she's convicted, the businesses might be sold to new owners, but the business models and market positions would persist. The construction mafia model has been copied by other gangs and criminal networks. What began as the firm's innovation has spread across Cape Town and to other South African cities. Even if Stanfield and Johnson are successfully prosecuted, the model they perfected will continue to be used by other syndicates. The uncertainty around the new evidence discovered in 2025 adds another layer of complexity. If the investigation is widening to include more senior officials, it suggests the firm's capture of state institutions extends beyond what has been publicly revealed. There might be political figures, senior bureaucrats, or business people who facilitated the tender fraud and are now being investigated. If these individuals are charged and prosecuted, it could deal a more serious blow to the firm's institutional connections. Alternatively, if the new evidence represents a procedural complication or weakens the state's case, it might embolden the remaining members of the enterprise. They might calculate that if Johnson and Stanfield can successfully defend against the charges despite a decade of investigation, the syndicate is effectively immune from prosecution. This could lead to expansion rather than contraction of criminal activities. The trial scheduled to begin in 2026 will be one of the most significant organized crime prosecutions in South African legal history. The complexity of the case, the number of charges, and the amount of evidence to be presented suggest proceedings will continue for months, if not years. the state faces a significant burden of proof. Under Posse, prosecutors must establish the existence of the firm as an ongoing criminal organization, demonstrate that Ralph Stanfield and Nicole Johnson held leadership positions within it, and prove that the murders, fraud, and corruption were all undertaken in furtherance of the enterprise's goals. This requires connecting crimes that occurred at different times and different places involving different specific actors into a single coherent enterprise narrative. The challenge is that the firm operated through a cellular structure. Different individuals handled different aspects. The firearms corruption involved one set of actors, primarily police officers, who have their own separate trials. The tender fraud involved Nicole Johnson, Glomix employees, and potentially municipal officials. The murders involved gang members like Jonathan Cloete and Abraham Wilson. The state's theory is that these cells were all part of a unified organization. Ralph Stanfield connected the gang violence, providing enforcement and territorial control. Nicole Johnson connected the economic crimes, managing finances, and corporate operations. Together, they formed the leadership of an integrated criminal enterprise. The defense strategy will likely focus on creating doubt about these connections. Defense attorneys may argue that the tender fraud, if it occurred, was separate from gang activity, just corporate crime unrelated to the firm. That the murders were independent acts by gang members settling personal scores, not coordinated hits ordered by leadership. That the firearms case from 2014 is too old and doesn't prove anything about the couple's activities in subsequent years. That there's insufficient evidence connecting Nicole Johnson to the violent crimes or Ralph Stanfield to the corporate fraud. The cellular structure that protected the firm during its operations might also provide defense arguments. If different people handled different aspects with limited communication between them, it becomes harder to prove the unified enterprise structure POCA requires. The trial will also involve significant evidentiary challenges. For the murder charges, prosecutors need witnesses who can testify about planning and coordination. But witnesses in gang cases are notoriously unreliable. They face intimidation not just from the accused, but from gang members still operating freely. Some potential witnesses may have criminal records themselves, making their credibility questionable. Others may recant previous statements or suddenly claim memory failures when called to testify. The documentary evidence for the fraud charges is more reliable, but defense attorneys can argue about interpretation. The handwriting analysis showing one person completed multiple bids can be challenged through competing expert testimony. The forged signatures might be blamed on subordinates rather than the directors themselves. The biggest evidentiary challenge is connecting Nicole Johnson to the violent crimes. Even if prosecutors prove the firm existed and committed murders, did Johnson know about these crimes? Did she participate in planning them? Or was she simply a businesswoman whose husband happened to be a gang leader and whose business operations were separate from his criminal activities? This is where the POCA enterprise structure becomes crucial. If the state can prove the firm functioned as a unified enterprise with Johnson and Stanfield as co-leaders, her knowledge of and participation in all aspects of the enterprise can be inferred. But if the defense successfully argues for separation between the corporate activities and gang violence, Johnson might face conviction only on fraud charges while being acquitted of racketeering and murder. The Stanfield-Johnson case forces uncomfortable questions about South African institutions in the post-apartheid era. How did a criminal syndicate manage to capture portions of municipal procurement for over a decade? Why did it take the murder of a government official to trigger the level of scrutiny that revealed the tender collusion scheme? The answers involve multiple levels of institutional failure. At the operational level, officials processing tender applications failed to notice irregularities that should have triggered investigation. The fact that multiple bids were completed by the same person, certified by the same police officer, with forged signatures, suggests either incompetence or corruption among the staff reviewing applications. Procurement oversight systems existed but weren't effectively implemented. The mechanisms to detect fraud were in place, including requirements for independent bids, verification of company registration, and background checks on directors. These mechanisms failed repeatedly over more than a decade, allowing Glomix to win contract after contract despite connections to a known gang leader. Police infiltration by gang members compromised investigations before they could gain traction. The 2022 High Court warning that 28's gangsters had wormed their way into police management suggests this wasn't just low-level corruption. Gang associates or sympathizers had obtained positions that gave them access to intelligence about investigations, allowing them to warn the firm and undermine cases before they reached prosecution. There are questions about political will. Did elected officials hesitate to act against the firm because the syndicate had community support in areas where elections were contested? Did politicians receive campaign contributions or other benefits from businesses connected to the syndicate? The investigation into Malusi Bui suggests political dimensions that haven't been fully revealed. The construction industry's acceptance of gang mediation as normal business practice created an environment where extortion flourished. When major corporations like Atterbury publicly state they had no choice but to work with gang-linked community organizations, it signals that private sector actors had given up on the state's ability to provide security and enforce the rule of law. This creates a vicious cycle. Gangs establish territorial control. Businesses negotiate with gangs rather than resist. This legitimizes gang authority and weakens state authority further. More businesses conclude they must negotiate with gangs to operate. The state's authority erodes further still. The Stanfield-Johnson prosecution represents an attempt to break this cycle by charging the leaders under POCA, blacklisting their companies, and seeking lengthy prison sentences. Authorities are sending a message that gang mediation won't be tolerated. Whether this message has any effect depends on whether convictions are secured and whether the state can actually reassert control over the territories where the firm once operated with impunity. As of late 2025, Ralph Stanfield and Nicole Johnson remain in custody in Brandvlei and Pollsmoor respectively, awaiting trial. The pre-trial hearing is scheduled for June 2026, but given the complexity of the case and the likelihood of defense motions and legal challenges, the actual trial may not begin for additional months. The new evidence discovered by police in May 2025 remains undisclosed, creating uncertainty about whether additional charges will be filed or whether the existing case will be modified. What is certain is that the arrest of Nicole Johnson marked a significant moment in South Africa's confrontation with organized crime. For the first time, authorities moved comprehensively against not just gang enforcers, but the economic architects who made criminal enterprises profitable and sustainable. The case represents a test of South Africa's institutional capacity to prosecute sophisticated organized crime. If the trial succeeds and results in lengthy POSA convictions, it establishes a template for dismantling criminal enterprises that have integrated themselves into legitimate business and government. It proves that the justice system can handle complex cases involving multiple defendants, numerous charges, and evidence spanning more than a decade. If the case collapses due to procedural issues, evidentiary challenges, witness intimidation, or revelation that the investigation was incomplete, it instead demonstrates the limits of the justice system when confronting deeply entrenched organized crime. It suggests that once criminal syndicates achieve a certain level of institutional capture and territorial control, they become effectively immune from prosecution. The outcome will have implications beyond the individuals charged. It will signal to other criminal enterprises whether this type of operation carries real risk or whether the rewards justify the minimal chance of successful prosecution. It will inform government policy about procurement reform, police corruption, and construction industry regulation. It will shape public perception about whether the post-apartheid state can deliver justice and security, or whether criminal organizations have permanently captured certain territories and institutions. For Nicole Johnson personally, the trial will determine whether she's remembered as a shrewd businesswoman who built legitimate enterprises while married to a gang leader, or as the architect of a criminal syndicate who weaponized government procurement to enrich a violent gang. The evidence will be examined, witnesses will testify, lawyers will argue, and eventually a judge will render a verdict that defines her legacy and potentially shapes how South Africa confronts the next generation of organized crime.